for Israelis and Palestinians alike.
Britain's representative at the UN, Dame Barbara Woodward there, speaking at the UN Security Council. Well, let's bring in Eylon Levy, a spokesperson for the Israeli government. Morning to you, Eylon. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Chris.
So your reaction to the United States then vetoing that UN vote on an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza?
A moment of great moral courage and leadership by the United States to stand up to a resolution designed to keep the Hamas terror regime in power. And it's important to understand that that is what the UK abstained on. In the early days of the war, the UK said that it wants Israel to win because it understood that in the wake of the October 7th massacre, the only way this war can end is with the total defeat and destruction of Hamas, because otherwise we'll find ourselves in the same cycle of violence again. And it is disappointing and disheartening to see so many nations voting in favor of a resolution that would save Hamas from the consequences of the massacre that it perpetrated on October 7th by intervening to keep it alive.
Are you surprised that the resolution didn't condemn Hamas's attack?
The United Nations has not found it within itself to condemn Hamas's attack. It has had opportunities before when a resolution came up at the General Assembly. Let's remember that the United Nations is not simply a brand, a mission statement. It is the sum of its parts. It is the sum of very many countries that have not historically been favorable or sympathetic to Israel as it fights to defend its people from the army of terror that perpetrated the October 7th massacre. We have no illusions about the United Nations. We think it is outrageous that the Secretary General chose to invoke Article 99, specifically in this case, where he hadn't in previous conflicts, because the true threat to international peace and security was the massacre that Hamas perpetrated on October 7th, and calls to end this war in a way that leave the perpetrators of the October 7th massacre free and emboldened to attack our people again, as they are threatening to do, are also a threat to international peace and security.
When are you hoping to see more aid get into Gaza?
We want to see as much food, water, medication and shelter get into Gaza, and there are no restrictions on the Israeli side. I believe at the moment around 200 trucks are entering a day. We have capacity on our side to inspect 250 trucks a day to make sure that terrorists can't smuggle weapons in, and we're further expanding that inspection capacity even though there is no real need for it. We understand there is a bottleneck, and that bottleneck is due to the capacities and abilities of the UN agencies on the ground to actually receive that aid after Israel has inspected it. But of course, we want to see as much humanitarian aid as possible reach the civilians who need it, while making sure that Hamas cannot steal it.
What is the latest when it comes to the fight and potentially some sort of ground invasion?
Israeli forces are finding themselves right now in intense close-quarter combat with Hamas terrorists. This isn't a war of airstrikes. It's a war in which our soldiers are on the ground fighting terrorists who have embedded themselves deep in civilian areas to try to use those protected facilities as human shields. I can tell you just yesterday in Shejaiya, for example, our soldiers were in a shootout with terrorists who were hiding in a school and tried to ambush them. And then when our soldiers got inside the school, they found a tunnel shaft inside one of the classrooms. Yesterday at the Al-Azhar University in Gaza, they found a tunnel shaft inside the yard, in the quad of the university, leading a kilometre away to a mosque. And they found a large weapons cache inside as well. So we're in close quarter combat every day. Unfortunately, we're suffering military casualties as well, including the other day, the son of a minister in the war cabinet, a former chief of staff of the IDF, a clear reminder of how much skin we have in the game, how much we're really fighting to defend our homes. And we're continuing to engage Hamas terrorists in close quarter combat, even though they have chosen to fight this war from out of the densely populated areas that we've been trying to evacuate so that civilians won't get hurt.
But the civilians are being hurt, aren't they?
Indeed, it is a tragic consequence of every war that civilians get hurt, and it's a tragic consequence of this war that Hamas launched. with the October 7th massacre and is choosing to fight out of densely populated areas. And in order to minimize harm to civilians, we've put in place measures unprecedented in the history of warfare to protect civilians in a very difficult and dangerous environment. It's why we surrendered the element of surprise in order to give civilians so much time to evacuate northern Gaza before the ground operation. It's why our soldiers secured a humanitarian corridor every day for civilians to be able to leave, even though Hamas was firing RPGs at our soldiers as we provided safe passage for civilians to leave.
But haven't you asked them to move to
any more suffering?
The south of Gaza and are now engaged in military action there?
No, that's a misconception. We have been asking people to move to a specially designated humanitarian zone, the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone. And we chose that because it's an area where Hamas has not already embedded itself under schools, under hospitals, under mosques, under clinics. It is disappointing and infuriating that international aid agencies have been directing civilians into urban areas where Hamas already has a military presence instead of to that humanitarian zone. And it's even more outrageous that Hamas has started shooting rockets from inside the humanitarian zone. Just the other day, a large barrage of 12 rockets at the Israeli city of Beersheba was fired from inside the designated humanitarian zone, and the international aid agencies on the ground have not condemned Hamas for exploiting the area where it was not previously operating in order to launch attacks against the Israeli people. And we're hoping that people will move into the humanitarian zone where Hamas has not already embedded itself. And that is where international aid agencies will be able to deliver the aid that they need and that we want to see reach them.
We must also, of course, remember the hostages that are currently in Gaza too. What is the latest there? When are you hoping to see more released? Is there going to be another pause in fighting, another truce?
We have 137 hostages still inside the Gaza Strip. They're being held without any access to the Red Cross. Some of them were abducted without their medication, some with life-threatening injuries, and we're demanding their immediate and unconditional return, and until then, Red Cross access. Now, we managed to get 110 hostages out, most of those as part of a hostage release pause agreed with Hamas, which Hamas decided to violate. On December 1st, Hamas decided to stop releasing all the women and children and to resume rocket fire at Israel. Now, that is disappointing. We would have wanted that hostage release pause to continue. Where it is possible to try to physically get our hands on hostages, we will do that. And we have soldiers who are now in a serious condition from what was supposed to be a hostage rescue attempt that was unsuccessful. And our strategy now is to continue putting military pressure on Hamas to create the conditions where it is willing to release more hostages in exchange for a brief pause in the fighting. That strategy was vindicated when we managed to get nearly all the women and children out. There are still 20 women and 2 children in there. And we'll continue putting military pressure on Hamas because the abduction of these people was a crime against humanity. And every day that Hamas keeps them in the dark and holds their families in the dark as well is an ongoing crime against humanity as well.
Eylon, thank you very much for joining us here on LBC News. Eylon Levy there, spokesperson for the Israeli government. This is LBC News. Your latest headlines are next.
LBC News.